Village Opera by Lu Xun, translated and read by Peter Rambo. Looking back on the last 20 years, I realized I'd only been to the opera twice. In the 10 years before that, I didn't have the chance to see any. I found nothing worthwhile in the two that I did see, and walked out before they'd even finished. The first opera I saw was in 1912 when I'd just come to Beijing. A friend of mine said the opera here was the best in the world, something I'd never experienced before. I thought the idea sounded excellent, especially in Beijing. In a flurry of enthusiasm, we left for the theatre. The play had already begun. Outside, I could hear the sound of cymbals clashing. As we passed inside, brilliant flashes of red and green passed before my eyes. I could make out masses of heads stuffed below the stage, but searching carefully, I could see some empty seats in the centre row. I squeezed my way through. Someone was trying to say something to me, but the ringing was still pounding in my ears. I strained to hear what they were saying. "Those seats are taken, you can't sit here." We retreated to the back of the theatre. An assistant with a shining cue led us to one side and pointed out a vacant seat. This so-called seat was actually a bench narrower than the length of my leg and 2 or 3 times the length of my shins above the ground. It looked more like a torture device, and lacking the courage to try and climb on top of it, I rushed out of the theatre instead. After walking a short distance away, I heard my friend calling after me. "What's wrong with you?" he asked. I realised I'd dragged him out with me. "Why did you just keep walking?" he asked. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Sorry," I said. "I couldn't hear you over the sound of those cymbals clashing." Whenever I thought back on this afterward, it did strike me as strange. Either this play was particularly awful, or there was something innate in me that was repelled by the stage. I've forgotten what year it was when I went for the second time. There'd been flood in Hubei, and proceeds were going to the relief fund. It was when Tan Shinpei was still alive. It was 2 yuan for a ticket, and a number of famous actors were to be performing, including Tan. I mainly bought the ticket so the vendor would stop hounding me, and then someone began lecturing me on how important it was to see Tan perform. I'd forgotten the disastrous experience of a few years before, and I bought the ticket for far too much, so I decided to go. I asked around and found out that Tan was to be coming on late in the performance. The theatre was in a modern building, and I presumed there'd be no fighting over seats, so I didn't have to worry about leaving until 9 o'clock. It was completely packed. It was hard to even get a place in the standing section. I squeezed my way in somewhere at the back, and could make out an old woman singing on the stage. She had burning strips of paper sticking out of her mouth, and next to her was a devil soldier. Thinking about what it could be, I realised it must have been Mulian's mother from Mulian Saves His Mother, as a monk came onto the stage. Unable to recognise the actor, I asked an overweight, wealthy-looking gentleman who squeezed in beside me who it was. "Gong Yun Fu," he said, and looked at me with scorn. Embarrassed, feeling my face flush, I resounded not to ask anything more. I watched the old woman continue to sing, then another woman, then an old man, then someone or something I couldn't be sure of, then a group of people fighting, then 2 people fighting. 9 o'clock became 10 o'clock, 10 o'clock became 11 o'clock, 11 11, 11 o'clock 12, and still 10 hadn't come onto the stage. I'd never waited for anything so patiently in my life as I did for that actor to appear. Not only that, but the gentle next to me was wheezing the entire time. On the stage the drums pounded, the cymbals clashed, the green and gold flashed brightly, and as 12 o'clock descended, I knew I was not made for the opera. With a machine-like motion, I squeezed my way back out of the crowd. The empty space I left began to fill up again instantly, presumably by the huge gentleman's mass that had been kept back by my body. Finally, after much repeated shoving, I reached the entrance. Almost no one was outside except for a few cars waiting to pick up guests who were still at the opera. A small group of people were reading the programme, stuck up against the wall. Some others were standing around doing nothing, presumably waiting to watch the women as they left the show. The cool and crisp evening washed over me. I don't think I'd ever felt such invigorating air in Beijing before. That was the night I bade farewell to Beijing Opera. I didn't think about it again. Even though sometimes I would pass by a theatre, nothing there drew me in. We were polar opposites. A few days ago, however, I unintentionally came across a Japanese book. Unfortunately, I've forgotten the title and the author, but it was purely about Chinese opera. One chapter explained how the use of loud drums, shouting, and acrobatics was overwhelming for the audience and wasn't suited to indoor theatres. It was actually much better enjoyed outside with a sparse audience and a distance between them and the stage. That was exactly what I had thought, and then I remembered that I'd seen a show outside and enjoyed it a lot. The book described exactly the problems I'd felt those 2 times in Beijing, and why it seemed so terrible in comparison. It's a shame I can't remember the title. The opera I had enjoyed resided in a very distant place in my mind. I can't have been more than 11 or 12 at the time. It was a custom in Lu Village for a married woman, as long as they didn't have too much responsibility to the family they'd married into, to return during the summer and spend time with their parents. Although my father's mother was still healthy at the time, there was a lot to do around the house, and so my mother could only leave for a short time around tomb sweeping day. After visiting the family graves, we would squeeze in a few days to stay with my maternal grandmother in a tiny village called Pingjiao, literally flat bridge. It was a very remote place, not far from the sea. No more than 30 families lived there, and they were all farmers and fishermen, except for the one family who owned a small store. I thought it was a wonderful place. I was always treated very warmly, and I was never made to recite the tiresome Confucian classics. There were a lot of villagers my age to play with, and because I'd come from so far away, their parents gave them less work so they could come and join me. Because the village was so small, a guest coming to visit one family was basically the guest of everyone. Though some were a little older and more loosely related, everyone shared my mother's name Lou. We were friends, and though sometimes we would fight and bicker, not much weight was given to the eldest of us. They were almost all illiterate and knew nothing of Confucian philosophy and the rank that would have normally given them. Almost every day, we would go to dig up worms and put them on the end of copper hooks to fish for shrimp at the riverbank. Shrimp might be the most foolish animal in the world. Every time they would put their feeders over the hook, and after a few hours we'd have a massive pile of them to take home and eat. After that we would go and herd the cows, but they were much harder to manage. They seemed like bullies to me, and I was always afraid to get too close. When the local children saw me standing back, they'd laugh. Reading the Confucian classics didn't count much then. My favourite thing to do when visiting Pingjiao was to go to Jiao village to see the opera there. It was a larger place, only about 2 miles away. Pingjiao was too small to hold its own opera, so every year they would donate some money to Jiao village, and the performance would be considered a joint effort. I never really thought about it at the time, but it strikes me now that perhaps the opera had some religious connotations to do with the coming spring. Unfortunately, by the time we got to the jetty that morning, there were no boats available for us left. There was one much larger ferry which ran every morning and night, but it was far too big to book for just us, and the smaller ones wouldn't be able to carry us. We asked around, but everything else was already booked. My grandmother was very frustrated and began complaining very loudly to the family about no one booking anything. My mother tried to console her and said that we'd have plenty of opportunities to see much larger operas in our hometown as they played several times a year. I was so upset though, I was on the verge of tears. My mother tried to console me in any way she could and urged me not to make a scene as this would only make Grandma angrier. But she also said I couldn't go with anyone else, as that would worry her too. In the end, there was nothing I could do. That afternoon, my friends all left, and I presumed the opera had begun. I imagined I could hear the clashing drums and taste the delicious soybean milk they were drinking. That day, I didn't go to try and catch any shrimp. I could hardly eat. My mother was upset, but she didn't know what to do. In the evening, my grandmother saw how I was feeling, and she said it was perfectly understandable. There was no way to treat a guest. After dinner, everyone who had gone to see the opera came back and began talking about it excitedly. Only I stayed silent. When they saw how I was feeling, they sighed and said how sorry they were. Suddenly, though, the smartest of us, Shuangxi, had an idea. "Well, what about your uncle's boat?" he said. "That should be back by now." It dawned on us that he was right. There'd be enough room for all of us. I was so excited. But then Grandma pointed out that we were all children, and she didn't want us going there alone. It wouldn't be fair to ask an adult from the village to go with us. All of them had to get up early for work, and the opera went on late into the night. In this moment, when all seemed lost, Shuangxi spoke up again. "I'll look after him," he said loudly. "The boat's big and sturdy, and our brother Lou is sensible. He won't run around everywhere. Plus, we spend half our lives in the water. We can swim like fish." Yes, every one of those children was born by the water. A few of them were the most incredible swimmers I'd ever seen. I knew we had my mother and grandmother convinced. They smiled and didn't try to argue. We rushed out in that instant, a heavy weight lifting from my heart, my body feeling as though it had swelled to twice its size. In the distance, I saw the white-sailed boat under the moon, moored by the flat bridge from which the village got its name. Everyone jumped on board. Shuangxi rushed to the front and Afar to the rear. The youngest came with me into the cabin, while the eldest stood at the back. Before my mother could catch up to us to even say be careful, we'd already left. We pushed off from the moor, floating out a few feet, and then passed under a bridge. The 2 oars were set up, each manned by the boys, changing shift every third of a mile. The sound of our chatter, laughter, and shouting mixed with the lapping water against the bow of the boat. On both sides as we flew towards Jiao village, emerald green fields of beans and wheat arose. The water was dappled with mist. The scent of the beans, wheat, and the weeds wafted around us, and as the moonlight shone faintly through the mist, in the distance grey hills like the backs of rising iron beasts seemed to be racing past the back of our boat. But still, I felt our progress was too slow. After the boys rowing had changed shifts a few times, it was possible to see the outline of Jiao village, and I could hear the sound of singing coming closer. There were lights too, which I guess must have been the stage, unless they were just lights from the fishermen. The music was probably flutes, rising up and down. It soothed me and almost sent me into a dream state. I felt as though I'd drift away with it through the heavy night air, surrounded by this scent of beans and wheat and weeds. And as we approached the village, I saw there weren't fishermen's lights after all. I realized we had been looking at Jiao village. Just ahead of us was a wood of pine where I'd played just the year before. I recognized the broken stone horse that had fallen on its side and a stone sheep crouched in the grass. Just as we passed by the wood, the boat rounded into a cove and Jiao village was just before us. Naturally, our eyes were drawn to the stage, which was placed in a plot of empty ground by the river outside the village. It was serene and hazy in the distant moonlight. We could barely make it out from its surroundings. It looked like some kind of dreamland I'd seen in pictures, and here it was, and it had come alive. The boat was moving faster now, and I could even make out the figures on the stage in a blaze of bright colours. The river close to the stage was filled with the awnings of people who'd come to watch the play too. "There's no room near the stage, let's watch from a distance," Alfar said. The boat began to slow, and soon we arrived. Yeah, he was right, it was almost impossible to get close to the stage. We had to tie our boat so back we were almost closer to the shrine than the stage. We didn't mind though, we didn't mind having our own space, and we didn't want to be tied in with everyone else watching from the river anyway. Just as we were tying the boat up, a fierce-looking man with a long black beard came onto the stage. With a spear, he fought off a group of bare-armed men. Shang-Chi told us all that this was a famous acrobat who could actually do 84 somersets, one after the other. He had counted them himself earlier that day. We all crowded round at the back of the boat to watch the fighting, but unfortunately the acrobat didn't do any somersaults. Some of the bare-armed men did some moves and then trooped off. Then a young girl came onto the stage and sang in a solemn voice. "There aren't as many people this evening," Shang-Chi said. "I guess that's why the acrobat's not doing what he normally does. I guess he doesn't want to show off without a bigger audience." That did make sense to me, and by then, really, there weren't that many people left still watching. All the farmers had to work the next day, so no doubt they'd already gone to bed. There were just a few or so unemployed still watching from Zhao Village. The families of the wealthier people were still there, on the boats with the black awnings, but honestly, they didn't really seem that interested in the opera. Most of them now were eating cakes, fruit, or melon seeds, so that didn't really count for much of an audience. To be honest, I wasn't that keen on the somersaults anyway. What I really wanted to see was one of the snake spirits, clothed in white, their two hands wriggling like a snake's head. After that, I would have settled for a leaping tiger dressed in yellow. But I waited, and they didn't appear. The young girl was followed by an old man, acting as a young man. I was starting to feel quite tired, and asked Kai Shang if he could buy me some soybean milk. He came back a bit later and said, "There isn't any. The death man who sells it's gone. There was some in the daytime. I drank 2 bowls then. I'll get you some water to drink." I didn't drink the water, but made the best of it. I can't really say exactly what I saw then, but it was very strange. It was like the faces of the players began to merge into one flat surface. Many of the younger boys were yawning now, while the older ones were talking about something else. It wasn't until a clown in a red shirt was stuck to a pillar on the stage and an old man started whipping him that we all roused ourselves to watch again and laugh. I think that was probably the best scene of the evening, but then the old woman came back. This was the character I dreaded, especially when she sat to sing. I could see everyone else's disappointment, and they felt just as I did. At the beginning, the old woman had walked a little bit back and forth singing, then she sat down on a chair and continued. I'd had enough. Shang-Chi and the others started swearing. I waited patiently, till after a long time, the old woman raised her hand. I thought she was going to stand up, but no, she just lowered her hand and went back to her original position and carried on singing the same song. A lot of the boys were groaning. The rest began to yawn. Finally, Shang-Chi couldn't take it anymore. He said the old woman might keep singing till dawn, and it was best if we just left. We all agreed, and suddenly our attitude seemed the same as it was when we set out, filled with enthusiasm again. A few of the boys ran to the back of the boat. Still swearing about the old singer, they set up the oars, and we headed back for the pinewood. Once we left Zhao Village, the moonlight seemed unnaturally bright. When I turned back to look at the stage, it seemed as it had when we first arrived, just this faint, hazy pavilion, covered in a strange and eerie mist. Once again, the sound of the flutes rose in my ears. I thought maybe the old woman must have finished, but I wouldn't suggest that we go back to check. The pinewood fell behind us, the boat was moving fast, there was such a thick darkness around us I could tell it was growing late. As the boat carried us back, we began laughing about the play, the actors, swearing. The splash of the water was growing faint against the sides of the boat. To me then it seemed like a great fish carrying a freight of children on its back through the rising foam. Some old fishermen nearby who must have been working out all night stopped what they were doing and cheered at us as we passed by. We weren't quite back at Pingchao when the boat slowed down, and the boys said they were tired after rowing so much. We hadn't eaten anything for hours either. It was Kai Sheng who had the best idea at this time. He said that the beans on the shore were probably ripe, and we had fuel on the boat, so why didn't we just go and cook them? Everyone agreed instantly, and we headed towards the bank. The fields on the shore were lined with luscious ripe beans. "Hey, Afas, your family over here, and old Louise over there. What should we take?" Shang-Chi had been the first to leap ashore and was calling at us back from the bank. As we all joined him, Afas said, "Wait a minute, I'll take a look." He walked up and down, feeling the beans. "Take ours, they're much bigger." With a shout, we all scattered through Afas' family's bean field, taking a handful of them from every plant. Shang-Chi thought if we took too many and Afas' mother found out there'd be big trouble, so we all went to old Liu's field to take some from there too. After we returned, the older boys started rowing again, while some of the others lit a fire, and the younger boys and I took the shells off the beans. Soon they were all cooking pleasantly, and we let the boat drift down the river, and took as many beans as we could and ate them straight with our fingers. When we'd all stuffed ourselves, we carried on down the river again, making sure to clean all the pots and throwing the bean shells into the river, hiding the evidence. Shang-Chi was getting a little worried because we'd used all the salt and firewood on his uncle's boat, and he was sure that the old man was smart enough to find out. But after we talked it over, we thought it wasn't too much to worry about. If he did tell us off, that was fine. We could take it. We'd just ridicule him right back. "Hey, we're all back," Shang-Chi called out as we approached the village. "I told you nothing bad could have happened to us. I guaranteed it would all be alright." I looked over his shoulder and saw that indeed we had arrived back at Pingchao, and someone was standing at the bridge. My mother. It was to her that Shang-Chi had been calling out. We passed under the bridge, stomped and moored, and all went ashore. My mother looked quite annoyed and asked why we were back so late. It was after midnight. But it wasn't long before she was in a good humour again, and she smiled and invited everyone to come into ours to have some rice. We all told her that we'd already eaten and were quite tired, so actually we'd better get back at once, and off we all went, back to our own homes. It wasn't until noon the next day that I woke up, and there was no trouble from Shang-Chi's uncle about the salt or the firewood. So in the afternoon, we just went out to catch shrimps as usual. "Shang-Chi, you and your little friends stole beans from our field yesterday.
And you didn't pick 'em properly. You trampled down a few, huh?
I looked up and saw old Leo was coming towards us. He'd just been selling beans himself, and there was still a heap of leftovers at the bottom of his boat. Yeah, Shrunksy replied. We were treating a visitor. We didn't mean to take yours to begin with. Look, you've fried away all the shrimp we were trying to catch. When the old man saw me, he stopped rowing and slowed down. Oh, treating a visitor? Well, so you should. Then he asked me, was yesterday's opera any good? Yes, I nodded. And did you enjoy the beans? Yes, I said. To my surprise, old Leo looked really happy. He put his thumb up and, sounding very satisfied, said, all these people that come from the big towns, they have taste, they know quality. No, I select my seeds for my beans one at a time. You know, us country bumpkins can hardly tell good from bad. Some people say my beans aren't as good as other. Anyway, I'll give some beans to your mother for her to give 'em a taste, eh? He drawled off and then rode away again. That night, when my mother called me for supper, there was a large bowl of beans waiting on the table, which old Leo had brought over for us to eat. I even heard him saying good things about me to my mother. Apparently he said, he might be very young, but that boy certainly has taste. I have no doubt he'll pass the imperial exam in the future. I sense an auspiciousness coming for your family. But when I ate old Leo's beans, honestly, they didn't taste as good as the ones we'd had the night before. You know, up until now, it's probably true, I've still never eaten such delicious beans, or seen such a wonderful opera, as I did that night.